I thought my apartment was haunted. The truth is so much worse. In retrospect, it should have been obvious from the start that there was something going on. It was my first time renting an apartment, but even I thought that the landlord was eager for me to move in as soon as possible. Rent was ridiculously low for the area, the apartment itself was in pristine condition, and the whole process from touring the apartment to moving only took about a week. Nothing like that comes without a catch. Apartment 311 was a pleasant place to live at first. It had 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and since I lived alone, that meant I got to convert 1 bedroom into my own office space. It came with a handful of paintings already, so it didn't even have the off-putting liminal feeling that some empty apartments have. The only immediate downside I could tell from the start was that there was a slight smell in the living room from time to time. It wasn't anything too noticeable, but you would occasionally get a faint whiff of some sort of musty odour. I was living in apartment 311 for a couple weeks before I noticed anything was wrong. It started off with simple stuff like various knickknacks being placed on the wrong shelves, snacks and small objects going missing, things like that. Once or twice I found the fridge left open. These things would only happen when I was asleep, and it made me feel like I was going crazy. There was no way anyone could be breaking into my apartment just to steal some useless scrap and move around some collectibles. The door was locked whenever I went to bed, and even if someone hypothetically had a key, I always made sure to bolt the door as well. I considered getting some security cameras set up, but I balked at the price when I looked into that possibility. Though the apartment was admittedly cheap, between rent and utilities I still couldn't afford to set up an entire security system. I tried to put it out my mind, assuming that maybe I was just sleepwalking or getting up for a midnight snack and forgetting by the next morning. I'd never been an easy sleeper. I was often prone to night terrors and other disturbances, which had only gotten worse now that I was in an unfamiliar environment. Of all the sleep problems I've experienced, by far the least pleasant is sleep paralysis. It used to happen fairly rarely, maybe once every 2 to 3 months, but after moving to the apartment it became almost a weekly occurrence. Now, usually my sleep paralysis is fairly mild. I find myself unable to move, eyes open, and I find it difficult to breathe. Sometimes I feel like there is a presence in the room with me, but before I moved I had never experienced any form of hallucinations, visuals or otherwise. I'd never seen a ghost, monster, hag or any other sort of entity while I was paralysed. It was only ever a sense of dread and total paralysis of the body. That changed about the same time I noticed the missing food and misplaced objects. As usual, it felt like I had woken up but couldn't move a single muscle. It was hard to breathe and I had this awful feeling like I wasn't alone. I tried to calm myself down, to remind myself that I'd been through this before and it always wound up okay. But something felt different. It was then that I noticed the door to my bedroom slowly opening inch by inch. I could hear the creak of hinges as it swung inward. Someone or something was coming into my room. He peeked his head around at first, dull eyes reflecting a faint glow of moonlight from my bedroom window. He was bald with pale, flaky skin. I wanted to scream when I saw his expression, but I was still a prisoner of my own body. The man had a full rictus grin on his face, chipped yellow teeth clenched tightly together, grinding against one another. I watched in horror as the rest of the man's body slowly passed into the room, tiptoeing as if he were creeping up behind someone in a cartoon. The man was utterly emaciated, almost skeletal in appearance, and covered in sores and pockmarks. He was stark naked and smeared in dirt and filth. I could do nothing but watch as he slowly inched ever closer towards me until I could feel his hot breath upon my face. It smelled like the musty odour I sometimes detected in the living room. Not once did I see his expression change. He didn't even blink as he stared at me, and I could feel hatred radiating off him like heat from a furnace. He just stood there, looking at me for what felt like hours. Eventually he turned around and slowly sneaked back out of the room, gently shutting the door behind him. A few minutes later I started to be able to move again, the paralysis wearing off as my body started to wake up properly. I had to call in sick to my job that day. The experience was such a shock to me that there was no way in hell I'd be able to get any work done. I spent a good hour just checking every room to make sure I was entirely alone. I searched in the closet, underneath the sinks, in my office, anywhere I thought someone could be hiding. When I found nothing, I managed to convince myself it was all an hallucination and I was safe. Things continued the same for a while after that. Objects still went missing from time to time, the smell in the living room stayed just as musty as it ever was, and about every week or so I'd have another sleep paralysis incident. Of course, now every time I did experience sleep paralysis, I'd have to see my unwanted visitor again. I named him Jimmy to try and reduce the terror a little bit. Putting a silly name to a horrifying face helped lessen my fear slightly. As far as sleep paralysis hallucinations went, Jimmy wasn't too bad once I started to get used to him. He never touched me or sat on my chest like some people's nightmares did. He just stood and stared. It was still deeply unpleasant, mind you, but I felt lucky that it was a consistent kind of unpleasantness at least. Then I found the photograph. I noticed it underneath a pile of papers while I was doing some cleaning up. A picture of 2 women embracing in front of a waterfall. I didn't recognise either of the women and I assumed it must have been from a previous tenant. I texted the landlord, Greg, and asked if he still had the old tenant's phone number so I could give her a call. He obliged and within a few minutes I was calling her. She picked up after a couple rings sounding slightly exasperated. Hello, this is Rebecca. Who is this? Hi, my name is Flora. I'm the current tenant of apartment 311. I think that you may have left a photograph behind you when you moved. I was wondering if you'd want to pick it up or I could mail it to you or something. There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. Hello? I asked. You need to get out of that apartment. You're not safe. I honestly didn't have any response but to laugh. Is this some kind of joke? I asked her between chuckles. I heard her sigh with frustration. It's not a joke. I'm serious. Things have been going missing, right? That got my attention. How do you know that? It happened with me too. My girlfriend and I kept noticing things being moved or disappearing while we were asleep. Little things mostly. Snacks, trinkets, nothing major. Now, I never saw this, but my girlfriend swears that one time when she got up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water, she saw this naked man just staring at her. He was covered in sores and looked more like a corpse than a person. She woke me up and we called the police, of course, but they didn't find anything. I think... Rebecca paused for a moment, choosing her words. What? What is it? I asked, increasingly panicked. I began to worry that Jimmy was just more than a simple hallucination. I think 311 is haunted. We asked around some of the other residents, and apparently the last guy to live there just disappeared. Our best guess is that he must have died and his spirit just never left. My girlfriend is into some occult stuff, so she tried a cleansing ritual or something like that, but it didn't work. Things kept disappearing, and eventually we just decided to move. I hung up the phone. It was rude, sure, but I was just so shocked that I didn't know what to do. At the very least, I began to understand why I got this apartment for so cheap. I found myself sitting on the couch for a while, occasionally getting a whiff of the musty smell. I stared blankly at a painting on the wall, one of the ones which was already there when I first moved in. It depicted a woman in a white dress sitting underneath a tree reading a book. I couldn't tell what was making me so focused on it. It seemed utterly unrelated to what was happening. Eventually, I snapped out of it and went to my office to do some research. After a little bit of digging, I found some information regarding the tenant who lived here before Rebecca. The one who disappeared. Apparently, some of his co-workers put out a missing persons report 6 months ago. His name was Michael Hansen, and I gasped when I saw a photograph of him. He looked exactly like Jimmy, albeit not so emaciated and filthy. I hastily packed some of my things and made arrangements to stay at a friend's house for a couple nights, telling them that my apartment had a roach problem and that the landlord needed to fumigate it. I called into work and gave them some sob story about an uncle dying. Enough to get a time off for a few days. With no more distractions from the ghost of Michael Hansen, I slept soundly on my friend's couch, unbothered by any sleep paralysis. The next 2 days were spent researching. I checked out dozens of books on folklore and the occult from the local library, scoured paranormal internet forums, and even watched a few episodes of some cheesy ghost hunting TV show. I was determined to figure out a way to put this spirit of Michael Hansen to rest. The stories were all wildly different, with countless potential solutions to my problem. Some sources said salt was a surefire way to banish spirits, others said iron was a good ghost repellent, but most simply said that I should give up and move. However, one myth piqued my interest. According to some beliefs, the spirits of the unquiet dead could be tied to objects from their life, binding them to the place where the object resided. If the object which their soul was bound to was destroyed, it freed their spirit and they could move on to the afterlife. I remembered the paintings. I had assumed they were all put there by the landlord, but it was just as possible they could be left there by Michael. I arrived back to the apartment, determined to grab the paintings and burn them, laying Michael Hansen's soul to rest once and for all. I felt like some sort of hero, a badass monster hunter who saved the day with her intuition and a little bit of book smarts. One by one, I pulled the paintings off the walls, putting them into a cardboard box. I made a mental note to buy some lighter fluid on the way to the empty lot where I planned to burn them. I approached the final painting, the one which showed the woman in a white dress beneath the tree. I pulled it off the wall and recoiled as the musty smell increased in intensity. Staring in confusion, I saw a small rectangular hole where the painting used to be, about 4 feet off the ground and 2 feet by 2 feet in length and width. I shuddered in fear, remembering that Michael's body was never found. Perhaps he was murdered, his corpse hidden in the walls by some unknown assailant. I nervously flicked on my flashlight, peered within the hole and screamed. I ran out of the apartment 311 as fast as I could before calling the police, sobbing in terror. I had been prepared to find a body, maybe cut up into little pieces and wrapped in duct tape. I was ready for death and decay and rot. There is something fascinating about ghosts, something somehow romantic about the notion that part of someone could live on Earth after death. There was nothing romantic about seeing the clenched tooth grimace of Michael Hansen glaring at me with hate as he stood in the small section of a hollow wall, which he had been living in for the past 6 months. No, the image that I have got right now in my head is not an image that I ever wanted. I used to have a buddy that lived in the same neighbourhood a few streets over. One night we were having a couple of beers in his backyard while playing cards. I had some things to do the next morning, so just before 10 I said my goodbyes and shoved off. It was a short walk, maybe 15 minutes door to door, so I never drove. Anyways, it was a nice night, uneventful trip, but when I got home my roommate was coming out of the front door, coffee in hand and dressed for work. He gave me a funny look and said he thought I was asleep since my truck was in the driveway. I told him where I'd been and asked why he was going into work at night. That's when he kind of laughed and asked if I was drunk. We stared at each other for a minute and then he told me it was just after 5 in the morning and that he was going in like he usually did. In my entire life I had never felt more confused than I did in that moment. I could tell he was dead serious, but I knew I had just left my friend's house. I checked my phone and sure enough, 5-something AM, my roommate left for work. I paced circles in the living room for a bit and called the friend whose house I had just left. He groggily answered and confirmed I'd left at 10 in the previous evening. I had no idea what happened during those 7 hours of my life and it gives me chills to think about it all these years later. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't tired, no one could have slipped anything in either of the 2 Coors Lights I'd had, no known medical conditions that would have caused me to black out, and nothing has happened like this since. I just don't know what happened to that time. I knew a girl who said that while home alone she heard a tapping sound on the floor of her kitchen, in brackets coming from the basement. She's worried it might be a pipe leaking, so she uses a house phone to call her dad, and he tells her not to worry about it. After hanging up the house phone, her cell phone immediately rings. It's her dad, telling her to call the cops and get the fuck out the house because he heard someone breathing on the other end of the line. She gets out the house and calls the cops. The cops show up, search the house, and find some psycho in the basement with a machete. Apparently he had been tapping it against the basement ceiling in an attempt to lure her downstairs. If she'd gone down into that basement, she probably would have never came back up. Why do I do this to myself? Why do I willingly read these stories? The next one is called The Attic, which for some reason really unsettles me. This did not happen to me, but to one of my good friends. He told me this story when we were sharing scary or unsettling things we'd experienced. I believe that it's true. He was turning ghost white as he continued telling the story and was close to tears when he finished. For the sake of making writing easier, I will write it from his perspective. I lived in a small bay town when I was younger, a town small enough to the point where everyone knows each other and any gossip would be consumed by the town in less than an hour. I had a friend who I would address as Jake, and we did everything together. There wasn't much to do in a small town, so we'd usually play video games all night and drink if we could find any alcohol. No, Jake always talked about how he'd hear strange noises in his house at night, especially when he was alone. His house was old and apparently a murder had happened at that house and other people died there due to other causes such as an illness. Horror stories were common to keep children out of danger in small towns, or just for older kids to scare the young ones. I was 16 and Jake was 17 at the time. We had planned to stay up the entire night playing video games, eating snacks and drinking some beer. He had recently started talking more and more about odd things about his old house, but I brushed it off as him trying to scare me. Everything was normal when I walked to his house that night. We went to his bedroom, which was on the bottom floor of the house, and started our night. His parents were out that night, so we had the house to ourselves. About an hour in, I left his room to go use the bathroom. The bathroom was up a flight of stairs which opened to a hallway down the length of the house, with the bathroom being at the end of the hallway, and above it was a ceiling to the attic hatch. After using the bathroom, I noticed the ceiling hatch was open and thought it was strange, so I went back to Jake's room and told him. Both of us went back and just stared at it, trying not to show the uneasiness that was tying a knot in our stomachs. We closed it and turned off the upstairs light at the bottom of the staircase and went back into his room. An hour and a half later, Jake had to use the bathroom. Before leaving the room, he busted a joke about how the hatch was going to be open again, and as a joke in return, I'd said I'd walk upstairs with him to investigate. We turned the corner that led to the staircase, and the hair stood on our necks as we saw light shining down from upstairs. We looked up the stairs, seeing the wide open attic hatch. We slowly approached it and quickly closed it and ran down the stairs as fast as we could back to Jake's room, slamming the door shut and locking it. Neither of us had the stomach or bravery to hide our fear at that point. We were so paranoid that we slept in the same bed. We didn't hear any noises as we tried to sleep, but eventually I managed to drift off. Falling asleep, I woke up and found myself in a dream. The world was black and white and I realised I was in Jake's room, and it felt so realistic that I didn't even notice I was dreaming at first. I got up from the bed and something drove my body over to the window. Between two hedges which had previously not been there, a lady in a wedding dress stood below an arch that was overgrown with dead vines. She turned around and saw me and started to smile. At first it was not too creepy, but then her smile started getting wider and wider until it reached both of her ears. A ring filled my ears and then she started laughing. Something started scratching at the door that was to my back. But no matter how hard I tried, my eyes were locked on the lady in the dress. I could not move and I was paralysed with fear. At that moment I woke up, but I was on the couch in Jake's room and not his bed. His eyes were wide when he saw I was awake and asked if I was up any time during the night. Confused, I told him no. Then he told me that in the middle of the night I got out of bed and stared out the window with a wide grin on my face. He explained that after that I left the room and he heard a large thump. Then I came back into the room and fell asleep on the couch. Once we cleaned up that I left his room, our curiosity bested us and we decided to look upstairs, only to see that the light was on and the attic hatch was wide open. Oh no, 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 no. I need to go and check my attic hatch. Oh, I can't be doing this. I had awesome parents who let me sleep in the living room on weekend nights when I was very young because my sister was a light sleeper and I could stay up until dawn. But of course, I always end up sleeping on the couch because a nick at night made me tired. So, one night I wake up to a prickly feeling. Like an instinct, just bolted into a sitting position and stared out the front window. We lived in rural Georgia, so you can imagine the magnitude of trees. In perfect light cast from the moon, I see a silhouette of someone in this fucking tree. The family dog dashes to the window and is snarling into the glass. Terrified, I run into my parents' room and try to explain to my parents that there is a strange person outside. Dad grabs something defensive and darts outside with the dogs to beat the wax off the hothead. I tremble in Mum's arms until Dad comes home and says how he saw no one and to go to bed. I decide to sleep in my regular bedroom. I fill my sister in as to what happened. Dad is making irregular rounds the house with a cup of coffee. We're all still and I finally think I can sleep. Nope. I notice the man outside my window. From what I can see in the moonlight, he gives me a shush signal and runs away. Just turns around to run a straight line away. I swear I couldn't stop crying for what felt like hours. I've been lying down for hours now. It's 5:35 AM and there's not much I can do. You know what the worst part of my situation is? I'm in the same room as my parents. They keep looking at me and I can't help but look back and try not to cry or scream. Their eyes are focused on me and their mouths are wide open. There's a strong scent of blood and I feel paralysed with fear. Here's the thing, the second I make any hint that I'm not asleep anymore, I'm completely fucked. I will die and there's nobody around to save me. I've been trying to think of a way out, but the only idea I have is to rush for the front door and scream for help, hoping my neighbours hear me. It's risky, but if I stay here, I'll surely die. He's waiting for me to wake up and see his masterpiece. You're probably wondering what's going on. I do get ahead of myself sometimes. About 3 hours ago, I heard screaming from the other side of the house. I got up and went to check on the noise before realising I had to use the restroom. Instead of doing the smart thing and investigating, I used that bathroom. There was blood on the carpet. I got very worried and ran back to my room, hiding under the sheets like the coward I was. I tried to convince myself to go back to sleep, that it was just some really vivid dream or something, but I heard my bedroom door open. Like the terrified child I was, I peeked out from under my blankets to see what was going on. I could see something dragging my dead parents into my room. It was not human, I can tell you that. It was hairless, with no eyes and no clothing. It walked like a caveman with its back slouched as it dragged my parents. But this thing was much smarter than any caveman. It was aware of what it was doing. It propped my dad up on the edge of my bed and made him face me. It then sat my mother down in the chair and positioned her towards me as well. It then started rubbing its hands on the walls, staining them with blood, and then drew a circle with the devil's pentagram in it. This thing had made what it would probably call a masterpiece. To finish it off, it scribbled a message into the wall that I could not read in the darkness. It then positioned itself under my bed waiting to strike. The scariest thing is now, my eyes have adjusted to the darkness since then and I can read the message on the wall. I don't want to look at it because it's terrifying to think about it, but I feel I need to see before I'm killed. I peek at the creature's masterpiece. I know you're awake. Sleep is not an option for me tonight, it's just not. Growing up, I always knew my brother was different. I wasn't supposed to know, but I did. It wasn't so much a secret as it was deep family shame. My parents refused to acknowledge it, and as a result, he never received the help he so desperately needed. But the full extent of his deviancy didn't become apparent until his early teens, a secret of which I've kept from everyone, even my brother. If he knew that I knew, I'm not sure what would happen. It was an accident. That's how it all began. We were playing around in my mum's study, and I knocked over one of her many porcelain figures, a cute Dalmatian puppy, the fragile thing breaking into a dozen of unrecognisable pieces as it hit the hardwood floor. My brother stared at the broken mess for minutes, before Mum stormed in and started yelling. My brother didn't flinch though, just stood in silence as she cleaned up, his eyes never leaving the ominous shards. A few days later, our neighbour, Mrs. Zielinski, reported her dog Maya missing. She was a precious Dalmatian puppy, little over a year old. They found pieces of her for days, hacked violently into fleshy bits. A heinous act of pure cruelty, they called it, and I immediately knew it was my brother. I suppose I still wanted to test my hypothesis though. So a week later, I accidentally broke into the figurine, this time depicting a plump little boy. I ignored my mum's scolding, keeping my gaze locked on my brother. He didn't move an inch, just stared at the headless figurine on the floor. My mum locked the study after that incident. A few days later, Billy O'Donnell disappeared. 10 years old, freckled, a bit on the heavy side. They found his body 5 days later. It took another 2 before they located his head. The expression frozen on his face was one of unimaginable pain and fear. I knew then for sure what my brother was, and I swore to myself to keep it secret, to keep him safe. I would become the help he always needed. He'd happen upon broken remains of porcelain figures all throughout his teenage years. A young, beautiful woman, a dapper middle-aged man sporting a broad-brimmed hat, a frowny-faced old lady cradling a cat, a handsome fellow in a sparkling red jacket. Some turned up in tiny pieces, others were never found. You can never know that I know though. Know that I'm the one who breaks them. Know that I deliberately leave them where you can find them. Know that I paint the figurines myself. One to resemble the slutty cashier that kept flirting with my husband. One to resemble my pervert of a boss. One to resemble the horrid old hag that lets her cat piss on my property. The last one to resemble my cheating asshole of a husband. Don't worry, they won't be missed. They're all just broken porcelain figurines now. I was home alone on Christmas Eve. My parents had gone out to grab some last minute things. I was about 6 or so and was just playing with my toys in my room when I heard heavy feet walking around. I remember sneaking out of my room and peeking around the corner to see a large figure with shiny black boots walking around. I thought it was Santa and I was awake, so I panicked internally. I snuck back into my room, put my toys away and then went to bed. I found out when I was 16 that it wasn't my parents trying to convince me that Santa was real and that they had no idea what I was talking about. A guy had broken into our house but thought no one was home and thankfully didn't look fuck around too much. Okay, that is terrifying, but also why are your parents leaving you at home alone when you're 6? Wait, isn't that illegal? A girl in her teens gets called upon to babysit some kids on a Friday evening. Apparently she watches those 2 girls pretty regularly. Anyway, the parents leave for the evening and said they wouldn't be home until around midnight. The teenager puts the 2 young girls to bed around 9 PM. She does what most people would do, go downstairs and watches TV for a while. She watches TV for about an hour or so, and by this point it's getting pretty late. She's in the living room on the main level. The TV sits in the corner of the room with large windows on each side of it. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she sees what she thinks is someone walking by the window outside through the bushes. Naturally, she gets pretty freaked out. She ends up calling 911 and the police arrive. The police check outside, didn't find any signs of anyone walking around. The police officers assure her that she's safe and that the lighting from both the TV and lamp probably played tricks on her by reflecting off the window. The teen agrees that's probably what it was. It asks them to check inside the house for her just to be safe. The police reluctantly oblige and start randomly checking the rooms, closets and garage a bit haphazardly. They roll their eyes a bit as they wonder how much this girl's imagination has run wild. Well, turns out they find a man hiding underneath one of the little girl's beds. I guess as the story goes, it was the little girl's mother's ex-husband. The babysitter didn't see someone walk past the window outside. What she saw was a reflection of him walking behind the couch. Fuck that.
At 3, she jumped off the bed. At 7, she unbuckled her seatbelt. At 12, she went to a sleepover at a friend's house. At 17, she finally received her driver's license. At 26, she said yes. At 30, she went into labour. At 39, she had one last hurrah. 46, she signed the papers to make it final. At 55, he was diagnosed and had no one to share the news with. At 61, she celebrated her remission with a night out. At 22, she looked at herself in the mirror. At 87, surrounded by her family and friends, she smiled. There are moments before every tragedy, quick flashes of boredom or happiness, of the expected and unexpected. These moments I see. The little girl jumping off her parents' bed and into an unresponsive final state. Another girl attending her first sleepover, excited and giddy, only to succumb to an unknowing fatal nut allergy. The young woman whose proposal near the shoreline was poorly thought out, never allowing her to live to see her marriage. The old woman who finally divorced the man she came to loathe, and for that man to not take the finality of it all with dignity or peace. A man whose diagnosis was terminal. The woman whose 40th birthday ended in heartache and disaster. The girl whose last glimpse in the mirror was of herself, relieved, then raising a pistol to her temple. These moments, as innocuous as they seem, are the final looks to life before tragedy ultimately hits. And I watch them. I have to. It's my responsibility to take you all from this realm to the next. It's my duty, and I am sorry. I truly am. Because now, at this moment, they read the final sentences of a story. Some bored, some happy, some expecting this ending, some not. And I watch as they read these last words, fully oblivious as they are that this is their moment.